I wanted to try out some Heller model kits. Now I haven't built Heller model kits since I was a kid, and I wanted to kind of experience what they were like now in their current yellow boxing. Where better to start with a new brand than with their starter sets? Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the Heller F6F Hellcat starter set in 1/72 scale. Let's get this one down onto the workbench. So I've already done a full unboxing on this kit and shared my thoughts about it, and whilst it's technically a starter set that comes with paint and glue and stuff, it's less than ideal. So unfortunately I'm not really going to be able to build this as a true starter set. It will probably just have to be built as a normal model kit, and this is something I've discovered about Heller kits, is that the starter sets are like just normal kits but with a few extra paints and things. They don't really get you as started. We'll see about that as we get into the build. For now, let's get a list of the products I used on the screen, which might give you some suggestions on what to get if you fancy replicating what you see in this build. I have already done a full detailed unboxing, so check out that dedicated video if you would like to know more about what's specifically included inside the box. In this video, I'll be focusing on what the kit is like to build and then rounding it off with a review at the end. As usual, I'll cut the parts from the sprue using my side cutters and then sand away the flash using a sanding stick or sharp knife. This is a slightly old tooling, so there are going to be bits of flash and things in a few places. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice and will be used throughout this project. The first step was to glue together the various engine components, and you can probably notice that they are quite crude. They were built up by layering them together and then installing them into the rear of the front of the engine cowling. The engine cowling itself comes as two parts, and this was then glued together. This could then be glued onto the front of the engine cowling. Make sure you read the instructions here though, because I have made a bit of a mistake and I wonder if you will be able to spot it before I tell you about it. Of course, I didn't realise I'd made the mistake until right at the end of the build. The cockpit has this kind of tub which gets glued onto the rear bulkhead. I did have to open up the hole slightly for the control stick, but this whole assembly was then glued into the fuselage side. A very simple control panel with questionable details is included, and the gun sight component was glued into the slot at the top, which was then also glued into the fuselage half. Humbrol 80, which is a grass green kind of colour, would be painted onto the internal areas of this particular kit. I'm only going to bother putting down one hand painted layer, and some people do ask me time to time, why do you only do this? Why don't you put loads of paint down and make it look amazing? And this is kind of a tatty kit, and you're not going to be able to see a great deal through the cockpit canopy later anyway, so why bother wasting my time? One coat of this paint will be enough to give an impression. Vallejo matte black paint would be used to pick out the control column, the gun sight and the control panel. A decal for the control panel is included, but the decal film extends quite a bit of the way around the outside, so I had to make sure to cut that away so that it would fit neatly. Humbrol decal fix will be used to help stick it onto the plastic parts, and after they were soaked in warm water, the decals were slid into position. I would carefully position the decal, and then a little bit more decal fix would be used to further stick it down onto the surface of the model. The pilot seat has already been painted with the grass green from before, and this comes with some seat belts. So these were applied in exactly the same way, as they're also decals, onto this part. And when that was done, it would be glued into place inside the cockpit tub. I do quite like that Heller have included seatbelts, as you don't see that all the time in this scale, in such cheap kits. The other half of the fuselage can now be joined, and the fit was generally okay. But I would spend a little bit of time sanding the seams just to make it look a little neater. Now turning my attention to the wings. I did notice in my unboxing that there was a bit of a warp to some of the wing components. However, when I glue them together, actually things start to straighten themselves out. With the upper wings glued onto the lower wing parts, I then glued on the main fuselage. You'll notice that there is a bit of a gap here at the wing roots. The very simple way that I kind of fixed this problem was to add some more cement and sort of hold it in position to close up these gaps. And now it's time to add on the engine I built earlier, and this is where I made that mistake. So earlier on I had already glued in the sort of engine cowlings and I put them on the wrong way, and that basically means that the vents are on the wrong part of the aircraft. They should be at the top instead of at the bottom. But I didn't notice, so that's my fault for not reading the instructions. The tail surfaces were then glued into their slots at the back of the plane, and the tail wheel part was also glued into place. It is worth noting that no raised landing gear option is included in this kit. So unless you're willing to modify the model, it's going to be wheels down only, I'm afraid. The landing gear can be glued together at this point. This is fairly straightforward, which consists of the landing gear leg being glued onto the door, and then glued into the hole where the landing gear bay is. There's no detail inside of the landing gear bay, it's basically just a void. Don't forget to add on this other small component, which is also part of the landing gear door, and then I moved on to glue together the underside drop tank. This comes in two halves and was simply glued together. This was then added into the two holes on the bottom of the plane. These holes are always present, however, so if you don't want to install this, you'd have to fill them in. A part for the pitot tube on the wing is included, so this was glued into its hole here. And now I'm going to turn my attention onto the clear parts. Humbrol Clear Fix will be used to glue them into place, and I have to be careful because although this glue will dry clear and strong, it is a little stringy, so I just need to make sure I don't put it in the wrong places. I've already masked the very few clear parts using my normal method, which is to apply tape and then cut it to the size of the frames. And whilst it does technically come with a two-part canopy, I don't think it could be displayed open unless you were to make some modifications to the main canopy part. But with these two parts glued into place, it's time to move on to some painting. Now normally this would be the part where it would be time to prime, but I've decided to do something a little bit different with this one. Included in my version of the starter set, I actually got the Heller No. 15 Midnight Blue. But I had tried it a little bit on some spare plastic and I thought it wasn't very good. So I'm actually going to use this Humbrol equivalent, which ironically is also 15 Midnight Blue, but it comes in a rattle can. From my experience, rattle cans don't typically need a primer underneath them. They kind of act like one themselves anyway. So this was just sprayed over the entire model. This would be a much quicker step than painting the midnight blue from the bottle itself, and give a much more uniform and neat surface finish. After that had dried though, I did realise that there were some bits of the landing gear bay which hadn't actually fully received all the paint, so I did hand paint some of the Heller Midnight Blue into there. And whilst I did mix this paint quite thoroughly, I just really didn't like it. It just wasn't thick enough, it didn't have like enough coverage. It wasn't great, I didn't really enjoy it. But fortunately, it's only going to go on the inside of the landing gear bays, so I'm not even too worried about people seeing it. I did get some metallic grey, which is a number 53. This is a gunmetal colour. So I used this to paint the internal areas of the engine on the nose. Again, I wasn't particularly impressed with this paint. It seemed a little bit thin, a bit watery, and it didn't really stick to the plastic that great. A few thin coats of this paint would be needed, but I wasn't particularly impressed with it. And yes, I did give it a proper mix before applying it. As I was so unhappy with it, I decided to go back over the top with some gunmetal from Ammo MiG. This paint behaved much better and had a better level of opacity, which managed to cover up all of the blue that I didn't want to be seen. And now onto the decals. You do actually get a surprising number of decal schemes included in this kit. In my particular case, I've decided to go for the French version. which, seeing as this video is being released in February, makes sense, doesn't it? There are other schemes included, 2 US Navy versions and a Royal Navy version as well, and these are all included on the sheet. I cut the sheet into more manageable parts, selecting the decals that I needed for my particular paint scheme, but I'll probably save the other decals and maybe I'll find another kit or some sprues or something which I could use them on in the future, because it's always a good idea to save those spare decals. I dipped the decals into some warm water to help release them from the backing paper, and if you'd like to get your hands on your own brushwater mug, check out my merch store. It helps prevent you getting your tea and your brushwater mixed up. Ask me how I know. The setting solution I'm going to use during this build is Humbrol Decal Fix. I've already used it earlier and I might as well continue to use it during this build. A little bit of the decal fix could be added onto the model in the relevant place, then the decals positioned, and a little bit more decal fix would be added over the top to further soften them into position. So the decals are generally acceptable, but one thing I have noticed is that some of them, particularly the small stencils, are joined together by excess decal film. So it is worth running your knife around the decals to separate them if you come to build a kit like this. It was a little bit annoying having to do this, as I only realised after I'd already soaked them in water, so they started moving around, which was a bit annoying. So yeah, excess decal film is definitely something to be aware of. Also, whilst this does come with a number of stencils, I really question the value they add, because they are little more than just like blobs of text. They're not legible, they're not readable, the printing isn't particularly fine. It may be easier just to leave them off, because they don't really add that much to the look of the finished kit. The other larger decals though, they went on generally fine without any real problems, but again, they do suffer from excess decal film. So in particular, the ones on the tail here, which go on the rudder, they may need extra application of the setting solution to help the excess decal film kind of wrap around the tail surface and not appear too noticeable in the finished build. So yeah, decal application was generally okay, maybe a little tricky in places. I have experienced better transfers from other manufacturers, but again, I have experienced far worse. They applied to the model, there wasn't anything in the way of silvering, printing is generally okay. They're not the best, but they work. Whilst those decals are curing, I'm going to move on to some actual priming. These are all the bits of the model which I've not yet added, such as the propeller, the wheels, and the rockets. A quick coat of this primer should allow any paint, which I'm about to apply, stick quite nicely to the surface of the plastic. Whilst that is drying, some gloss red would be used on the pitot tube on the bottom of the wing. This Army Painter black paint was next to be used, and this was sprayed onto the wheels and the propeller. I did this because it would simply be a quicker way of doing it. And then this aluminium marker from Gallery would be used on the central spinner part of the propeller. I'd also carefully apply this marker to the tip of the pitot tube, parts of the landing gear, and the centres of the wheels. Humbrol 24, which is a trainer yellow, would be carefully painted on the tips of the propeller just to point out where the dangerous spinny bits are. And now the third and final paint that was included in my starter set is this 116 dark green. This was painted onto the tips of the rockets. It does seem crazy to me that they included 2 paints in this kit which literally were used for the smallest amounts. So the green on the rockets here and the gunmetal on the engine. Before I can add the propeller onto the aircraft, I do need to make sure to add the decals which go on there, otherwise I might forget. And now I'm going to protect the decals on the main model. This XW30 semi-matte varnish was loaded into my airbrush and applied over the entire aircraft to help seal in the transfers and also give a fairly uniform finish. I still want it to be a little bit glossy. When that was dry, the wheels would be glued onto the landing gear legs. The rockets would be glued onto their hard points on the lower side of the wing, and it is worth mentioning these are always moulded onto the bottom, these hard points. So if you don't want rockets, you may have to sand them away. The propeller was added onto the nose, and then I peeled away the clear canopy masks. and they seem to have done a reasonably good job. And that's as far as I went with my build of the Heller Hellcat in 1/72 scale. And that's another build under the belt. So this one is a bit of a weird one. It was kind of my first experience of Heller, coming back to Heller in the yellow boxes, and I think there are some good aspects and some bad aspects. So let's talk very quickly about some of the good aspects. In this kind of boxing, they do tell you on the box what the tooling date is. It's 1977. So I went into this like knowing that it was maybe going to be a bit of a clunky kit, but I have built in the past some kits from Heller around that sort of time period, 1970s, 1980s, and actually this seems to be like not quite as good a standard as those. It was a bit clunky, it didn't have that much in the way of detail, it wasn't great. There are some issues with this kit, and I think before I dig into them too deeply, I think sometimes it's a really good idea to get a second opinion from someone else who's also built the same kit, and I'm going to hand you over to someone who's built the exact same boxing as mine, but you'll notice that there are some differences, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I'm going to hand over to Captain VFC for their take on the Heller Hellcat. Over to you.
Hello everybody, Captain VFC here. Big thank you to Model Minutes for letting me jump in on this video to briefly talk about my experience with this. I bought the Heller Hellcat to do a starter set type build, sort of back to basics, using all of the things in the box, so the paints, the brush, the cement, etc, etc. And I immediately realised that that was not going to be possible, or perhaps the best use of this kit. The kit itself was fine, showing its age a little bit. It's kind of what you'd expect. There's no massive amount of detail, but what is there is fine, and it generally captures the shape of the Hellcat in a good enough way for the time. Certainly I was not expecting it to be anything particularly special. The issues arose from the paints that Heller chose to put in the box. They list that there will be 3 of them, but in fact there were 4. Except 2 were the same. They supplied a US Ghost Grey, 2 pots of Ocean Grey number 106, and a black green to go on top. So they give you 3 of the colours needed for the Fleet Air Arm scheme only. And this is a little strange considering 3 of the 4 decal options are blue, but hey, I guess I'll go for the Fleet Air Arm version. In the end, I opted to use some of my own paints in addition to the ones provided for things like the interior, the propeller blades, the wheels, that sort of thing, but it was still made predominantly using the parts that Heller had provided. The paint is too thick, the shades are somewhat questionable, and in my experience you'd be better off just chucking them in the bin or buying the version without paints included. Overall, whilst I might recommend the kit, I certainly wouldn't recommend buying one of these starter sets because ultimately I just don't think they're worth the extra price. I do feel that the simple addition of a dark blue paint would have completely transformed my experience into one that was less frustrating. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. Back over now to Matt for the rest of the video.
So thanks to Captain VFC for sharing their insights there. And it is a bit of a weird model. So Captain VFC built their kit using their included starter set paints, and they got completely different paints to what I got included. So that gives me the kind of impression that in the Heller sort of packing space, the warehouse or whatever, they're just picking paints which are listed on the box and then just chucking them in. So you're kind of like completely at random going to get different paints. So Captain VFC got completely different paints in their boxing to what I got. They were able to kind of replicate the Royal Navy version, whereas I could only technically replicate the US Navy or the French version. Additionally, what value does including 2 other paints, which are used on so little, in the kit. So the tips of the rockets, in my case, that was like the only thing that needed the dark green, and the gunmetal grey. Yes, you could use the gunmetal grey on the gun barrels and the landing gear legs and things like that, but it wasn't very good. The paints that were included weren't very good. So my recommendation is, if you're going to get one of these kits, maybe just save your money and just get the version without the starter set paints included, because it's potluck what you're going to get, and also the paints themselves are not great. The dark green, I'll give dark green credit, it did go onto the model nicely on the top of that primer, onto the rockets, but the other two, the metallic and the gloss, not great. So yeah, let's talk about the kit then. So I do keep a track of everything that I do in my modeling journal. It's a little diary that I keep to make sure I remember what I did. And if you want to get your own modeling journal to keep track of your own builds on your own workbenches, feel free to check out the links below. It definitely helps the channel. So in here, I've written down, this is a simple kit. It has 36 parts. There was some warping on the wings I noticed during my unboxing, but that went away after I glued it together. There is a bit of flash, but it's not too excessive. The paints included in this set were basically useless. You don't get enough to replicate the schemes properly. It's not a great starter set option in my opinion. The decals, you get 4 paint schemes. 4 paint schemes is fantastic in a kit of this sort of nature and this size. It's not an expensive kit. Typically the RRP for this kit is €9.99 for the starter set version, which is like really cheap. It's like pocket money set. So you got 4 decal schemes included, which is fantastic. And I'll definitely keep the other transfers to use maybe on some Overtrees from Edward, because I think they do a Hellcat as well. So that would be interesting to just sort of play around with that. So $9.99, very cheap price, 4 paint schemes. But the thing I want to swing back to with the decals is that although the printing is generally quite nice, the small stencils are basically pointless because they're just blobs. And also the excess decal film actually glues some transfers together and you have to cut them away from each other. But they went onto the model quite nicely and I didn't really have any problems there. I think detail-wise, it's quite crude, it's very lacking. Those rockets, I think they're supposed to be like high velocity aerial rockets like the American ones, but they look almost like RP3s, but they're sort of in between, so the design is a bit strange on that one. The cockpit was very crude and simple. Yes, I didn't paint it amazingly, but you can't really see into it anyway through the clear parts at the end of the build. I think the main problems I have with this kit are that there's no pilot and there's no raised landing gear option, which is very annoying because I actually went and bought some Heller display stands, which I made a video about separately, and I technically can't use them with this kit because there's no provision for a display stand, there's no raised landing gear option, so I don't know why Heller makes their own display stands, but it is what it is. If I'm being honest though, the one main thing that I'm annoyed about with this kit is the fact that I glued the engine cowling on upside down. Just the cowling part that goes around the outside, and it's completely my fault. The instructions are correct. This is just me sort of rushing and not paying attention. I glued the engine cowlings on upside down the wrong way, so the vent should be at the top and it's actually at the bottom, which is really stupid because I've built the 1/24th scale Airfix Hellcat, so I knew that. I've got it up on my shelf. I can use it as a reference, and it was just really dumb. It's just a dumb mistake, but I realised right at the end of the build that I'd done it. So yeah, I'm not the smartest when it comes to building models, but hey, mistakes happen, don't they? I didn't see the point in trying to fix it because it would probably ruin the paint finish I'd already applied. This is a kit which, very cheap, not going to break the bank. It's almost a pocket money kit. It is a bit crude, but I think if you want to mess around with something to have a bit of fun with, maybe practice some of your skills, this would be ideal. My only suggestion would be maybe stay clear of the starter set version. Use your own paints, get your own things for it, and don't go into it expecting too much. On the whole though, I did quite enjoy building this in the French paint scheme. It is nice to have something in a slightly different style, and the main reason I decided to do that was to take part in French February. If you're not familiar with French February, I'm going to hand you over to someone who can tell us a little bit more about it.
French February. What's it all about? French February is something I started a few years ago in a bid to encourage really myself to build unusual subjects. I have a passion for, I guess, alternative aviation, so things that are outside of my home country. So I've always loved the aviation of France, Poland, Sweden, and they're things that you don't often find in model kits. French aviation, particularly in World War II, was fascinating. I've done a few videos on it and I suggest you go check them out. But I've been trying to spread French February, and for the last few years I've got a couple more content creators and my community to take part. So I'm really glad that you've decided to take the challenge with me, Model Minutes. I'm really excited to see what you build, and well, the rules are it's anything French or anything that has served in France. And it doesn't have to be military, it could be a tractor that was on a farm in France. It could be that out there. Anything French, built or served in France. Oh, and it's a great opportunity to build some Hellcats too.
Thanks to Ms. Modeler for sharing the information about French February and how you can get involved if you'd like to do so. Of course, this is an aircraft which typically was used by France, but is generally an American design. But yeah, I think I've spoken about this kit enough. It's a bit old, bit clunky. It kind of works. I didn't hate it, but there were quite a few small problems with it. But the main problem I caused myself. And on that bombshell, I'm going to end this one here. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of my build and review of this kit, and if my assessment of it was fair. As always, a quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them or support the channel in other ways, check out the links in the description. I'd like to welcome our latest member of the club, Brian J. Green 69. Thanks for joining us. The best way to support the channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Once again, big thank you to Captain VFC for sharing their thoughts on this kit, and to Ms. Modeler for helping to promote this French February modelling idea. Finally though, I think the last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you all on the workbench again next time. Now normally this would be the point where it would Hello Hellcat. There we go. Still don't know where my clapper's gone. Don't know. I have to inquire and see about finding that. I don't even know where my instructions are for that. Let's just find that. I dipped the decals into some oh my word, why can't I use words today?